Malaria is one of the deadliest diseases known to man, causing the death of one child every 2 minutes. With over 445,000 deaths yearly, it is ranked as the 5th most dangerous disease on the planet. In the US, there are typically 1,700 cases per year, with nearly all of these being travelers or migrants, since malaria was eradicated in the US in the 1940s. Despite the relative ease of treating those infected with this parasite, malaria puts 40% of the population at risk and costs the African economy more than $12 billion annually. This has, and still does, cripple developing governments, making them unable to afford the costs associated with eliminating malaria. Individuals who had been forced to labor for the colonial powers sunk into poverty, leaving them particularly vulnerable to malaria, and they could not even rely on their governments, as these were also just recovering from decades of European rule. Unfortunately for those living in affected areas, this generated a cruel cycle of poverty and malaria. There are 4 distinct types of malaria, which is a parasite that infects the liver and eventually the red blood cells. The deadliest form of malaria is the Plasmodium falciparum strain. Symptoms include fever and flu-like manifestations, such as nausea and vomiting, and, if not treated, kidney failure, coma, and death. Malaria is an extremely complex parasite that has the ability to fool the immune system, quickly growing out of control. Malaria is a disease of the blood and is spread by any transfer of an infected individual's red blood cells. Oftentimes, this is accomplished by the female Anopheles mosquito, which is primarily active at night. However, blood transfusions, organ transplants, and unclean medical equipment are also viable vectors of exchange. Once the parasite enters the body, it infects the liver, where it multiplies thousands of times. After 2 weeks, the parasite begins infecting red blood cells. At this point, contact with the individual's blood can lead to the spread of the disease to another person. Malaria is very easy to prevent since the mosquito that transmits the parasite is primarily active at night. Sleeping inside an enclosed house, using a mosquito net, or even wearing a long-sleeve shirt are all effective methods of eliminating contact with the female Anopheles mosquito. Alternatively, managing mosquito breeding grounds and developing infrastructure will assist in limiting mosquito populations, as well as keeping them far from vulnerable humans. Spraying homes with insecticides has also been shown as a very effective method of limiting cases of malaria. It was the development of infrastructure, along with the spraying of pesticides, that allowed the US to eliminate the disease from the country. Malaria is not a problem of the limitations of technology, as we have had the means to eradicate this disease for decades. Rather, it is a question of wealth. Short-term solutions such as bug nets are relatively inexpensive and are an effective preventative measure for the near future. With eventual development of the affected regions of the world and efforts to make a vaccine, there is hope to eradicate the globe of this disease. Once infected, anti-malarial drugs are available and reasonably cheap. With access to drugs, the chances of dying from malaria are extremely slim. However, without access to effective drugs, malaria can be deadly. Unfortunately, a majority of those at risk live in poverty in places such as Africa and South America, without sufficient housing. Mosquito nets and drugs are relatively cheap, with the average cost of treating malaria being only $5. However, this can be more than the average African makes in a week, limiting access. This is the biggest factor determining malaria's association with poverty. Even if affected families are able to scrape together a sufficient sum of money to buy drugs, they risk purchasing these drugs from shady dealers. These drugs can be ineffective or even outright dangerous. Access to substandard medical services can even be a vector for further spread of the disease due to unclean equipment. Eliminating malaria in affected regions with other methods is an option, but the governments in these areas often lack the wealth required to develop infrastructure, maintain breeding grounds, or even spray insecticides. These factors conspire to create the perfect breeding ground for malaria, causing nearly half of the world to be at risk. $12 billion is spent on malaria every year in Africa, making it a massive economic burden on an already poor region of the world. Malaria has an even greater cost on the growth of the economy, as those who are sick are often unable to work. In families where one of the members becomes sick, the cost to purchase drugs, as well as money not earned due to time away from work, can generate large amounts of debt. This has the effect of keeping impoverished regions poor. A vicious cycle is then created, where a lack of wealth cuts off access to prevention and treatment, which in turn makes these areas more vulnerable. Malaria then costs these regions large amounts of money, making them even more vulnerable than before. With the economic disparity that has formed in the past few years, malaria has become increasingly intertwined with poverty. This is not because of a lack of technology or medicine, but of wealth.